Welcome to the Happier Life Project, the official podcast from the award-winning mental health and wellness app, My Possible Self. Hosted by broadcaster and journalist Gabby Sanderson.
Hi, how you doing? I hope you're well. Welcome to today's bonus episode of the Happier Life Project. Cold water swimming, sea dipping, ice baths. It feels like everybody's talking about the power of cold water therapy lately. From boosting mood and reducing inflammation to helping anxiety and building resilience, the benefits sound incredible. But how much of it is backed by science? And how much of it is just social media hype? To help us separate fact from fiction, I'm joined by one of the world's leading experts in extreme physiology, Professor Mike Tipton. Professor Tipton has spent over 40 years studying how the human body responds to extreme environments. From freezing seas to scorching deserts, he's published over 850 scientific papers, books and reports. And he's worked with the likes of the RNLI, the Royal Air Force, UK Sport and the English Institute of Sports. He's also a fellow and president-elect of the Physiological Society, chair of the National Water Safety Forum, and was awarded an MBE for his services to physiological research. In this episode, we'll dive deep, pun intended, into what really happens when you take the plunge, exploring the science behind cold water immersion, the cold shock response, and the potential mental health benefits associated with this trending practice. We also talk about safety, breathwork, and why research is still needed before we can take every viral claim at face value. So whether you're a seasoned sea dipper or just cold curious, get ready to find out the truth about cold water therapy. What's hype, what's helpful, and what you really need to know before jumping in. Ready to find a healthier, happier you? Let's get started. Welcome, Professor Mike Tipton, to the Happier Life Project. We are talking about the science, I suppose, of cold water immersion / therapy. It's become quite a trendy thing to do, I would say, over the past few years, both in the sea, this cold water swimming, but then also it seems to be becoming more and more popular to have these like ice baths at home or these cold water plunges in the back garden for those that can afford it. So thank you for being here to share some expertise and to kind of tell us what's the real deal actually when it comes to the benefits and then the things that are probably exaggerated for marketing purposes.
Yeah, well, that's a pleasure. It's nice to be with you, Gabby.
So if we could just start with the basics, what is actually happening to our body when we first immerse ourselves in cold water?
So the first thing that happens is there's a very sudden and dramatic fall in skin temperature. Mm-hmm. And about 0.18 millimetres below the surface of the skin, you've got lots of cold receptors. We're a tropical animal. We want to be naked in air at about 28 degrees Celsius. So going into cold water is particularly stressful. And those receptors get stimulated, particularly in the first seconds, and send a lot of information centrally, and that results in what we called back in the 1980s the cold shock response. And it starts with a gasp of about 2 litres, which I'm sure everybody watching this podcast has experienced. It's when you went into the shower that they told you was hot and it ran cold, or it's a big inspiratory gasp. There's about, as I say, 2 litres, and that's often followed by uncontrollable hyperventilation. At the same time, the body shuts down blood flow to the skin because it's trying to conserve heat and protect the important organs in the middle of the body. and cardiac output goes up, which means your blood pressure goes up. It's a bit like shutting down all the radiators in your house and turning the central heating pump up. So you've got this sudden urge to breathe. You can't breath hold anymore. The gasp response breaks your breath hold, and you've got a sudden increase in blood pressure. So inevitably, about 60% of the deaths that we see going into cold water each year are caused by that response, the cold shock response. It used to be, we thought it was hypothermia, but a lot of the work that we've done and others has pointed towards this initial response. And just to make the point that 2-litre gasp, that uncontrollable 2-litre gasp, the lethal dose of water into the lung is about 1.5 litres. So the first breath in, if you're in the wrong situation with a wave breaking over your face, or you've dived in, or you're in a capsized vehicle, or you've jumped from a height, is enough to start the drowning process.
You're not selling it to me, I have to say. I do know people that absolutely love it and they're almost addicted to doing it. It's like a real adrenaline rush, I suppose. And then there's people like me that are not so fond of being freezing, and putting that shock to the system just doesn't really seem very appealing. I'll stick to my yoga,
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a few things you said there which are absolutely true. Most, as I say, we're a tropical animal. We want to be naked in 28-degree air, which is what most people are thinking about for a summer holiday next year. And when you talk about, but of course the other thing you talk about is an adrenaline rush. One of the things that happens when you suddenly lower the skin temperature and those cold receptors fire is you get a release of the stress hormones. And that's when people start to talk about, I feel really alive, it wakes me up, it sets me up for the day. Well, yes, it does, because you're initiating a fight or flight response. The body is desperately trying to react to get you out of this, what it perceives as a very hazardous environment. The other thing that can happen, however, with repeated immersions, and it doesn't take too many, it's about 5 or 6 2 or 3 minute immersions, that cold shock response can halve. And all of a sudden, you've lost control of your breathing in the first minute or so of immersion, and you suddenly begin to regain it. Of course, when you've lost it, the recommendation, and you'll see this in the RNLI Float to Live, Fight Your Instincts public health campaign, is to stay still. About the worst thing to do then is start thrashing around, waving your arms. By far the best thing to do when you first go into water and you've lost control of your breathing is just float, stay still until you get your breathing under control. So we all actually think, if you were to push me, when you were to talk to people about who do this, they're absolutely adamant that it's life-changing. Yeah. And I do a lot of work with the blue tits, and I talk to lots of ladies that do cold water dipping, and some of them are in tears telling you how it's changed their life. Mostly it's mental health rather than physical health improvements. In fact, I think it's only the sort of over 65s who start to talk about it making them feel a bit fitter. The science on the kill side of the equation is very much better and more definitive than that on the cure side. Quite a lot of the stuff on the cure side of the equation is anecdotal. It's people asking people who are doing it, do you think it's good for you? And surprise, surprise, they say yes, because why would they say no? But anecdotal evidence is still evidence. And
I can't help but thinking is part of the thing that people love so much is it's almost like a near-death experience that you've survived. So it's like that immense relief of, overcoming trauma.
No, you're absolutely right. When you look at, the trouble is nobody has really done a study which teases out the active ingredient of going for a dip or a swim. So if you imagine it, what you do is you go to somewhere often beautiful, so there's green and blue therapy, you meet up with friends, so it's sociological as well, you overcome a challenge, which is the cold water, which gives you a sensation of achievement, which you've just alluded to. You also get distracted by the cold, so it's pretty much any other thing going on in your life you can't think about because you're just thinking about doing that. And of course then you do have things like you're exercising, you're in a weightless environment, there is cold, afterwards you're going to have a big hot chocolate and a piece of cake. So any one of those things, and until studies are done that tease out all those different potential active ingredients, we won't know. But, what I would hypothesize is the thing that's beneficial about going into cold water is probably also the cold shock response. So it's a little bit of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, if you like. But what that means is it's that sudden fall in skin temperature that drives all those neural and hormonal changes that may well be the benefit of what's good about it. We know the cold shock response peaks somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius, and we know that it only lasts a couple of minutes. So actually going into much colder water or going in for much longer, I don't think is of any benefit whatsoever. You're just moving more and more down the road of it being hazardous rather than helpful.
So when we're talking about like these cold plunges and cold waters and stuff, what roughly temperature are we talking? Because it happened recently to me. I'm in Portugal and I went swimming in this river. It was definitely cold, but I would say more fresh. When I got in, I was like, ooh. But once I'd been in like 30 seconds, it was actually really lovely. And yes, I was surrounded by nature and I was on a retreat, so I was with other people as well. But then I could stay in there once I was in, I was like quite happy floating around, and it was like I kind of got used to the temperature. But then I would imagine if I was in the kind of temperatures of a cold water plunge, that there'd be absolutely no way in hell I could be floating on my back, appreciating the skies and the trees and all of that stuff. So where's the kind of balance or the fine line temperature wise?
Okay, well, let's just run quickly through water temperatures. When you have a bath, and you get it nice and hot and, enjoy that, it's around about a temperature of 40 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
The water temperature that you can sit in without heating up or cooling down and just controlling your body temperature by changing the amount of blood that goes to the skin is 35 degrees Celsius. Once you get down below about 30 degrees Celsius, your body shuts down to the periphery. And once you get into about 25, a swimming pool temperature is normally around about 28 degrees Celsius. And that's where, if you exercise, you can probably maintain body temperature. Once you drop down into the below 20, into the teens, that's when you get, the sea temperature in the middle of summer around the British Isles might get up to 17 or 18. And it's the old saying, it's okay once you're in. And what that actually means is it's okay once the cold shock response has gone away. Okay. Somewhere between 15 and 10, the cold shock response peaks, and you really don't, you might be okay, but pretty soon after the cold shock response goes, you feel okay for a bit, and then you start cooling. Then you start cooling particularly the peripheral tissues and particularly in the limbs, the superficial nerves and muscles. And that's where we see people they'll go for a swim, and after about 10 or 15 minutes they can't swim anymore because they've become physically incapacitated. Once the water temperature gets down below about 10, you start to fire pain receptors rather than cold receptors. So it now starts to feel painfully cold. And that's what you see with ice baths. You might have a short period after you've first gone in and got over the cold shock response where it feels okay because your receptors have adapted, but very quickly you'll start to cool. And there's there's not really a strict definition of cold water because a lot of it depends on the combination of temperature and time.
Right. So then I've seen as well linked to this, especially I'm thinking of Wim Hof, using the breath and breath work as a way to, I think, overcome the pain of the cold, actually. Do you have anything to add on this respect with breath work and doing certain types of breathing when you're in this cold water?
Yeah. Number one, for the uninitiated, it's very difficult to impose any kind of breathing pattern on the one that is provoked by going into cold water. The one that's provoked by going into cold water, as we've discussed, is a gasp and then uncontrollable hyperventilation. As you go in more times, you begin to get more control of your breathing, or you get control of it sooner. Now, when you go, as I say, most of the evidence in favour of this approach, whether it be the Wim Hof method or ice dipping or cold water, is anecdotal. The scientific data are at best mixed, generally of poor quality because they haven't managed to have a proper control or there's been a limited number of people involved. And it's very hard to do proper studies when you're giving somebody something that they know and that you know and they know is likely to make them feel better against something it isn't, because there's an enormous placebo effect there. In fact, one of the interesting studies that were just recently published was one where some healthy midlife women with high depressive symptoms went into two groups. One group did the Wim Hof method and breathing, cold water and breathing. The other did warm water immersion and normal pace breathing. And I guess the somewhat surprising finding was that in both groups, so that's the one that had the intervention and the control group, there was around about a 20 to 27% improvement in things like depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and perceived stress. And what that tells you actually is that being part of a study is actually quite good for your mental health. Because both groups, the control group and the intervention group, showed about the same improvement. And actually, it's true, because when we do studies on people, you know, we welcome them into our lab, we look after them, they feel like they're making a positive contribution to the body of scientific knowledge. And of course, that will make them feel better about themselves and about what they do. So and until such time as we get properly controlled studies where they've isolated the active ingredient, I would say the jury is still out. However, going back to what I was talking about in terms of talking people who do it, to some extent, if somebody thinks it's changed their life and is doing them good and has improved their mental health, and it has improved their mental health, then so what? You know, okay, that's fine. All I'm saying is two things. Firstly, as a scientist, I want to know the method and the mechanism by which that's occurring, because we might then be able to induce it in people that can't go and do all of this because they're housebound or something like that. And secondly, when people do it, I want them to do it safely. And so I do challenge the assertion that anyone can do this, but they can't. There's a whole host of medical conditions which would really suggest that you shouldn't go and throw yourself into cold water. And then, of course, there's ways of doing it where you can maximise the chance of doing it safely and minimise the chance of a hazard. So, doing it in a controlled environment where there's other people, where there's lifeguards, going into the water slowly, making sure you've had a medical and that you're fit and healthy enough to do it, staying within your depth, not going in the water for more than 5 or 10 minutes, because I just don't think you need to. So there's loads of things you can do. We've published papers and people can Google them and find them about how to do this properly and how to provide this experience safely.
So then, is science saying anything about any physical benefits? I've read articles where it said strengthen immunity, reduce inflammation, that kind of stuff. Is there any evidence to that, or is this all hypothetical?
So when you read those papers, you'll see three things shouted about. Firstly, it awakes me, it alerts me, it sets me up for the day, and we've discussed that, and that's the cold shock response, that's the fight or flight response. That's adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, all these different hormones being released. You'll then have I haven't had a cold for a year since I've been doing open water swimming. And
I've not heard that one.
Okay, yeah, so we've done studies where the trouble is you can look at the cells of the immune system and you can see changes when you do, because this is a fairly stressful thing to do, so you'll see changes in immune function. Or you can look at things like upper respiratory tract infections. So when they've been looked at, we did a study where we looked at the upper respiratory tract infections of open water swimmers and their partners and indoor swimmers and their partners, and we found that those that did swimming had less fewer upper respiratory tract infections. But it didn't matter whether they did it outside or inside. So it didn't matter whether it was cold or warm water. So maybe there's an exercise component there. So, if you were to push me, I'd say on balance, we come back to that thing which is less is more, in that there's some evidence that short cold exposures may prime the immune system, but certainly if you overstay your welcome, then you start to impair it. In fact, there's a paper about to be published which suggests that if you're going to do cold water immersions, you shouldn't really be doing more than 2 per week if you want to get the right. We don't really know the dose. We don't really know the frequency, intensity, or duration. But I would argue a couple of times a week, and a short exposure is probably better than anything longer, because you start to get into a whole host of potentially hazardous conditions, including physical incapacitation, hypothermia, non-freezing cold injury, once you start to overstay your welcome. And the last one you mentioned, yes, cold water can be anti-inflammatory. It can provoke anti-inflammatory and reduce inflammatory cytokines. But again, the jury is still really out. Every single paper you read, Gabby, in this area has the caveat at the bottom which says more studies done that need to have larger numbers, more reasonable sample sizes, better controls, and less chance of bias.
Well, and also because you've mentioned a couple of times about this, where the sort of temperature waters, some in warmer, some in colder, and it seems quite similar. And I would say, well, we're made up of a lot of water, and I feel like it's just generally quite good for us to be in water, bathing, swimming. It's kind of back to nature, isn't it, really? Not necessarily doing a viral trend, but just being immersed, you know?
Yes, preferably in a water temperature that's not going to be hazardous. But I mean, if you go back in time, I mean, this is the reason we're talking about this is because there's been an enormous upswing in the number of people doing it. Yeah. I mean, it was driven by lockdown, and my local club in Perranporth went from something like 25 members to nearly 1,000.
Wow!
But in the background, taking to the waters, you alluded to, has always been there. The Romans, in amongst their hot baths, had a frigidarium, had a cold bath. People like Thomas Jefferson were doing cold foot baths, and people like Charles Darwin and Florence Nightingale, where you could go in the 1800s to Malvern and have 150 gallons of cold water poured on you. People used to go to the coast. I mean, places like Brighton, Penzance, some of the spa towns exist because of the waters they provided. So there's always been this therapeutic aspect to it. It's just that in recent times it's gone up in number. The temperature has got colder, I think, probably. And there's quite a lot of people who are doing it who, are putting themselves at unnecessary risk. So really what we want to ask is, if you took up yoga, or if you took up soccer, or if you took up hill walking or beach walking, would that have the same impact? And those studies just haven't been done.
Well, as we kind of wrap things up, I think like the takeaway for me is that what you're saying is, when we're looking at is this good for our mental health? Possibly a placebo, but providing we're doing it safely and cautiously, then you do you.
Number one is check that you're okay to do it, and then do it in a safe way, i.e. with other people in a controlled environment, limiting the exposure. The evidence is that if you're going to get a benefit, it's going to be a mental health benefit, as opposed to a physical benefit. And we don't know what that could be, from anything from overcoming the challenge to distraction to socialization to, there's lots of green and blue therapy. But yes, and again, it may well be anecdotal, but anecdotal evidence is still evidence, and a placebo effect is still an effect. So provided you're not putting yourself at unnecessary risk, fine. And what we will continue to do in the background is try and understand what the mechanisms are that are producing these changes, and whether or not what's causing them, whether or not they're real or just perceived.
So for anybody listening that maybe is a bit of a cold water enthusiast, or those that are curious to learn more, could we signpost to some of your resources, or where would be good to stay on top of? Because it sounds like you say there's still research being done in this area. So how do people find out more?
Well, in terms of safety advice, you can go to groups like the RNLI, obviously, the Royal Life Saving Society, the National Water Safety Forum, all of which have websites that you can go on and get information about how to do this, how to do it safely. If you go onto the University of Portsmouth website, you'll find the papers that we've published on exactly the same thing, minimising the risk in doing this, and you'll be kept updated with the latest research. So there are quite a lot of websites. There's the Open Water Swimming Society as well. There's quite a lot of resources out there. The only thing I would be careful about is there's also, as with every other area in the age of social media, where there's a lot of what I would call unfounded experts, where there'll be people telling you stuff, but just check what their qualifications are. Have they done any proper research in the area? Are they, affiliated with a group like the RNLI or like the RLSS or the National Water Safety Forum? Because you can get steered down the wrong direction.
Yeah. Great advice. Thank you so much for today. It's been really, really interesting. I'm still not convinced if it's something I want to do personally, but to each their own. Professor Mike Tipton, thank you so much for being on the Happier Life Project.
Thanks, Gabby.
Hello friends, it's Gabby back with you. If you are suffering with your mental health, there is a crisis button on the My Possible Self app, which will signpost you to the correct information for immediate expert advice. Those of you who are listening on one of the podcast platforms, the My Possible Self app is completely free to download. You can access all of the content, so you don't need to worry about it costing you anything. If you found this episode helpful, please do subscribe and leave a review and share it with your friends. And to find and follow us on social media, we are most active on Instagram, and you can find us at My Possible Self. And I've been at Radio Gabby. Until the next one, do take care. Bye for now.